Hello, my name is Trish Biers and I curate the human remains collections here at the University of Cambridge, specifically at the Duckworth Laboratory, where we house an amalgamation of human remains from across different departments. I'm really pleased to be here, and this is just a brief introduction into working with human remains and some of the issues that we face. And then I will be available at the panel to answer any of your questions. So what is the Duckworth Laboratory? Well, but it was established technically in 1945, but I am the only full-time staff member for this collection, and it is comprised of archaeological and anatomical human remains. We have a large non-human primate collection, fossil casts. We have a blood, hair, and brain collections that we're building actually all the time, plus an archive for biological anthropology at Cambridge in general. And this is just a sort of a map, essentially, of how our collections came to be in one place. And we have collections from the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, the anatomy collection, zoology, various colleges. And it's essentially from many researchers who've been in Cambridge over the last 200 years and expeditions that they've gone on and brought human remains back. And then Dr. Duckworth himself actually essentially tried to and succeeded in having the whole collection in one sort of major research space. So what's really great about the Duckworth, there's many things, but one of my favorite things is how we connect with lots of other institutions here in Cambridge. And that's kind of a fun part of my job, is getting to meet various people at other museums and to talk how to handle our collections ethically and responsibly. So what are the current issues around collections of human remains in museums and universities? Well, there's many, but some of the primary things that I work with are scientific research, looking at the dead on display, repatriation, and that's the return of remains to the country of origin, social media and images of human remains. And then I'm also part of a task force that looks at the sale of human remains, and this is linked to things like disposal. And then just in general, how do we look at disposal of collections of human remains, and should we be even considering that? I just want to make sure that everyone knows that I have, over 2 decades of experience in museums and collections. And so I'm very aware that everything essentially revolves around issues of staff time and funding and space. It's just part of the role, right? I mean, we're all dealing with these issues, especially funding and especially, after COVID. So everything I'm saying, in the back of my mind, I've thought about it in all these different ways and on this spectrum. And so when we do have the panel, please feel free to ask me questions about these things, because as I was told the other day by my coworker, I'm rather industrious when it comes to trying to come up with solutions for how best to handle some of these issues. I'm going to take that as a compliment. But just quickly, what is bone actually? And I think one of the things I see a lot when I talk to people at various sizes of institutions, whether you're a village hall with a gallery or a smaller museum or a national museum, human osteologists, and what I do, a bone scientist essentially, and a bone curator, there aren't very many of us. That expertise is sometimes hard to get in a museum unless you have collections specifically of human remains. So essentially, bone is a both organic and inorganic material. It's collagen, something that's actually in the building blocks of our skin as well. And it's also a mineral, which is hydroxyapatite, which gives it the hardening. So our bones are really amazing because they're a living, breathing, moving entity in our body, right? It's like our personal set of armor with our skull and our rib cage protecting, our most important organs, our heart and our lungs and our brain. So I like to tell that to children, especially, that it's like having your own personal set of knight's armor to protect you. But it's essentially, it's plastic and it's static. And what that means is it's strong, but it's also flexible enough. And that's why you would have, if you have a break, you may not break your bone entirely, you might just fracture it. And all of that has to do with this percentage of organic and inorganic material in our bones. And we're full, and essentially the system is a system of levers and support, and it's all obviously, you know, blood cells are produced in our bone marrow, so it's a crucial, our skeletons are crucial. Obviously it also allows us to be mobile and to stand upright. It also actually does act as a storage system too for fat and calcium. So you don't need to know all about bone anatomy or skeletal biology to work with collections of human remains, obviously, but it is, I think, a little important to understand how bones, what they're made of, and how they work, to then understand what kind of conditions we need to you know, put them in our collection store. With curation and conservation, you know, some of the basics would be bone identification and a basic osteology. Is that a humerus, your upper arm bone? Is that a skull? Is that your mandible, your lower jawbone? We do need to be able to identify bits of bone, and I'm very happy again to help anybody working with human remains to do this. So it's part of what I think is a nice collaborative effort to really make sure that we're managing the integrity of these collections. So things that I often look at with collections like these, with human remains collections, are treatment of the dead. So looking at decoration and modification, mummification. I work sometimes with bone objects, and then we look at ochre, so staining on bones. Is it red? Is it yellow? Is it black? Is it green? What does that indicate? Also thinking about tattoos. So if you have soft tissue, so not all collections are just bone. Sometimes you have soft tissue like skin and hair. And I don't mean to creep anyone out about this. I know there's probably some of you in the audience that are very uncomfortable with human remains. I have limited how many images of human remains that I'm showing in this talk, but there are some just in order for me to get my point across. So we do look to identify these other types of modifications in this treatment. We have collections from all over the world, so we definitely have that, where we also have sort of seeds and decoration in the hair and carving in the bone, and we have to monitor these treatments. Ooh, I don't know why it went that way, sorry. So other things we look at are obviously how bones were treated when they were either excavated or prepared in an anatomical lab will actually affect the appearance of the bones and what we need to then do. So you get greasy bones, and that's often referred to anatomical preparation. Dirty bones, lots of bones coming out of the ground for archaeology, you know, have soil impacted in them, and how do we deal with that? Lots of bones were marked. That was very common practice 200, 100 years ago. Obviously, it's not something we want to practice too much now, at least in the same way. You know, there's great methods, and I know that Cher does fantastic training on these things. So, but looking at also antiquated curatorial treatments, you know, using pesticides and poisons and things like that, you get that a lot on mummified remains, especially. And then mold, and just a shout out to Lorraine Finch's awesome, amazing mold class that she did for the Cher Museums training group. I absolutely loved a whole day learning about mold, and it's really come into practice here because unfortunately we do have a situation where we're dealing with fluctuating humidity, which we're actually getting the university to help us fix that, and it is an expensive endeavor, but it's obviously critical because bone will get mold on it, and you obviously have to monitor that. So these are some of the basic things I do on a daily basis of curating human remains and looking at conservation. And it's really lovely again to have a community like this, and a community at UCM, University of Cambridge Museums, as well as Cher, to have specialists to chat to, because I've had to reach out to many of you myself on certain types of conservation practices. So I thank you very much. Something that isn't often talked a lot about is repatriation and conservation. And in my previous positions, I've been very much involved in repatriation, whether it's the repatriation of human remains or objects. So we have to think about what is appropriate, and this concept of tradition of care in collections with ancestral remains, and that could be the removal of ink, say, before handing it over to a claimant community, wrapping these remains in very, organic materials. So I use a lot of organic cotton book tape rather than any kind of regular plastic tape, everything that could be potentially biodegradable. And I'm happy to answer questions about that. And again, you're always welcome to reach out and I can talk you through some of these things. So very much looking at how we treat human remains in the collection from a standard curatorial level, but now also looking at it and how it will affect or impact descendant communities, because that's something I have to deal with every day. So the images here, now on the top, that's what I did during lockdown. I painted sandboxes, but that is a cast, just so you know. That's not real red paint on a real skull. Some of you may have a love affair with your label maker like I do, and hence the pathology label. But I also just wanted to point out these tiny little eggshells that I found in the eye orbit, back here in the eye orbit of a skull from Papua New Guinea. And I'm actually working with a PhD student from Papua New Guinea who's going to be coming over and doing some research in the collections. And I really want to know what laid those eggs. And if it's a spider, I'm not going to like the answer. So again, just to reiterate, human remains are actually relatively stable. Humidity fluctuation can cause mold to grow on remains, especially if, and then also if you have soft tissue and hair. And all of these things can be dealt with, or at least discussed in a basic policy on human remains and how your institution cares for them, and all the other parameters of having a collection like that. And I'm happy again to help you write that or answer any questions that might make it easier for you. Human bone, one of the really important and probably the most important thing about skeletal remains in these collections is what can we do with them? And well, we can do quite a lot. And so the main thing we like to do is build osteobiographies. And I think you've heard of autobiography, right? Or any other kind of biography. Osteobiographies are essentially the same thing in that we're telling someone's stories, but through their bones. And I think this is really critical. There's been a real shift in the science and going away from sort of not thinking about the actual person, flesh on the bones, but now really thinking about how people lived during their life, rather than just focus on their death and how many grave goods they have and if they were elite or a non-elite, but actually talking about the story of those people. And we can do that through analyzing bones. And what's really cool about this is that we can actually tell stories that are often left out in the historical record. It's no mystery that stories of women, stories of LGBTQ individuals, stories of children have often been left out of the big narrative, especially, for example, where I work in South America, where you have these chronicles from the conquistadors talking about coming to Peru and seeing, women's work and men's work, and the focus was always on men's work. And so there's a whole group of individuals who don't have the same kinds of narratives. And you see this with the ethnically diverse. And so this is a chance for us to actually give a more accurate sense of who was living in what area and at what time period and what they were doing and what was their role. How did they suffer? Did they have different types of diseases? Did they have stunted growth? Were they nutritionally deficient? So through different types of tissues, we can actually analyze the story of people through their teeth and their bones and their hair, and get an idea of genetics, familial affiliation and kinship, although kinship is not always biological, it's very much cultural, right? So you may have aunties and uncles that aren't blood related, but they're still part of your kin group, right? So, but what's great about bones is that we can actually get an individual's life cycle from the time they were a child to the time that they're an adult and to the time of their death, and really look at all the different things, how tall or how short they were, what their heritage was, were they mobile, were they traveling or migrating to other parts of the world, and all of this is locked within our tissues. And so that's why it's critical to think about this, because it would be a shame to completely lose the human in this larger sort of examination of humanity in the past. we have the actual bodies to do that. And that doesn't mean that I don't have the most tremendous amount of respect for these bodies, because this isn't probably what they expected to happen to their bodies. And that's not lost on me. And that's something that I talk a lot about with the students here, because I teach on ethics and osteology and repatriation and treatment of the dead as well. So, and the students are very, interested in these topics. So it's really important to be thinking about using these people almost as ambassadors for their culture. And it wasn't actually their choice. So there's a lot to think about, but on a basic level, I think an osteobiography is just so incredibly important to tell a more accurate side of history. With that scientific analysis, so from a museum perspective and in looking at rationalization and review and retaining or not retaining these collections, destructive analysis is how we have to do a lot of this skeletal biology analysis. How do we look at these stories and the people? And through that is by destroying tiny bits of maybe dental plaque or a bit of dental enamel or a little bit of rib bone. And that can be in itself problematic, because bone is a finite resource. Skeletons are a finite resource. And we don't want to oversample them. We only want to take what we need to get the story that we need. And it's very minimal amounts. 20 milligrams of bone can actually give us quite a lot of information. But this isn't something that everybody agrees on. And so something that I have to do in my role is to really look at this. Now, I don't expect you to memorize any of this. I'm just giving you a little bit of breakdown, but what's critical for, I think, museum collections is what I've put here in purple or lilac or lavender, whatever, this lovely lighter shade of purple here, but it's traceability. I talk to a lot of people working in different museums and different collections who are really being inundated with requests for destructive sampling, and it is overwhelming. And it's very political, and there's a lot of sort of headbutting between geneticists and archaeologists. And so one of the ways that we can sort of mediate that is to have very specific standards of practice, and traceability is critical. I am amazed at how few people in the past left these sort of sampling slips in the collection. I'll open up a box and it says, something about, oh, this was taken on this date. Well, for what? By who? Why? Who did this? And some of you may understand what I'm saying because you're dealing with it as well. And that is beyond frustrating. So we really need to make sure that these things are happening, because you need to be able to trace where the human remains are going if you are going to allow them out for scientific analysis. And then at the same time, it's the researcher's responsibility to return any fragments and residues to the collections. Now, I ask for everything back. If there's anything left, I want it back, because should I ever have to repatriate that same collection, I will have everything there that I can for the descendant community. Again, this is controversial. And getting permission from descendant communities is really important before allowing any research on some of these collections. But here in Britain, if you're talking about British collections, it's less, it's seen as less problematic. There's a lot of fantastic research going on, and people aren't generally, I should say, upset about it. But you've got to get these fragments and residues back. And then consider how you're going to mitigate for media spin, because I see a lot of projects with human remains going on in various museums around the country, and whether it's destructive sampling or maybe CT scanning, so using X-ray technology to recreate something, or even facial reconstruction. Human remains are more potent for the political discussion and for ethics discussions than a lot of other remains in your collections. And so you've got to be prepared for that media spin, because everything is a sacrificial virgin, or the first time modified heads, cone heads. I see so much terrible language and around some of these articles, and you're probably all familiar with how the Daily Mail spins things, but human remains take on a whole nother level of care that we need to think about when we're talking about how we're going to promote or the research, or if someone's research, if a researcher is putting out a publication and your museum is mentioned in it, how are you going to approach that? So it is really something to think about. And a great example of that is this this discussion of Otzi, the Iceman. So human remains on a whole, and this is changing all the time now. I've seen it change more in the last 5 years than I have in 20 years, but are genuinely considered rather popular. If you go to, say, the British Museum and you go into the Egyptian Gallery, Egypt is kind of inherently popular as well. And I mean that with all respect, but it's human remains, it's mummies, skeletons. Some of the biggest exhibitions that I've ever been involved in, biggest meaning increase in numbers of visitors and attendance and outreach programs, have been around human remains and exhibitions on bodies, and whether it's skeletons or mummies. And so, for example, this Mummies of the World exhibition that made the rounds in the US pre and post 2017 had, we're talking over 1.6 million visitors, and that was only halfway through the exhibition's run. So you get a lot of interest from the public in actually looking at human remains. And in fact, recently, if any of you happen to see this, the mummy, the Egyptian Museum and Cairo's new museum, the Palace Museum, and they had this massive fanfare for transferring the mummies from one institution to the new institution, and it was several hours online, and songs and music and these chariots, these little jeeps that were to look like chariots carrying the dead. I mean, this was national fanfare all around the mummies and this celebration of a new museum and their new home, and where there will be their final resting place, so to speak. So this is big. And with this Otzi the Iceman discussion here, this is so in Bolzano in Italy, you have this museum that's centered around Otzi, and it has completely changed the economy in Bolzano, actually, with lots of visitors coming specifically to see Otzi the Iceman. And I would never refer to human remains in this way. An archaeologic sensation, media star, research topic, museum object. I never refer to human remains as objects. I know that that is incredibly disrespectful to many living cultures. But it's just to show that it's very much variable where you are as well. It's even though we're talking about what's happening here in Britain, go to another country, Peru or Denmark or Germany or Egypt, and you're going to get a whole different type of sort of presentation of the dead than you would, say, North America. So I just think that's quite interesting. I no offense, Bolzano, but I don't like how you're describing Otzi. I don't think it's very respectful. So repatriation is another issue that you have to consider if you do have human remains that perhaps are not of British origin, although there are communities here that would like to see British remains repatriated. And I love this quote by Geisen and White, which is a book about human remains in British collections. No universal approach can be established, as one community's methods may not be appropriate for another. This is where human remains can be time heavy for you as a collections person and in your collections, because I really think that each repatriation needs to be a case-by-case basis. You can have an overarching policy, and we all and I'll get into some policies in a minute, and that's fine. But, death is such a varied thing, and how people approach death and what their belief systems are and their ideology and how they actively engage with the dead now versus in the past. These things are so different and deeply philosophical. And so we need to be mindful of that. And that's where a lot of my time specifically would be to approach each one very individually, and to how I prepare the remains and how we have a ceremony of transfer if we do. So we invite people. So this is an image down below of a repatriation we did with the Office of Hawaiian Affairs. Repatriation is essentially in a broad sense means the return to the country of origin. But what it also means really for collections is a return of control, and a return of control and decision-making for an indigenous or descendant community, or also known as a descendant community or source community. That language depends on where you are as well, and how the community you're working with is keen to be identified as. So, but it is, so in some cases, people don't want to repatriate. They're fine with you being the custodian for their collections, their ancestral remains, but they want to have a say in what happens to them. And I've done, I think I'm up to 19 different ceremonies of transfer at this point. So I've, and each one is very different, and what people need is very different. But the common themes is, a sensitivity and a use of language, and just, I am from California, so just a mindfulness of what they're going through versus what you're going through, where you see these collections every day, whereas to them it's their ancestors. So it's very different, multiple types of viewpoints, multiple ways of making knowledge. These are really important things to think about if you are working with human remains that are not from Britain, that are from other countries that may have been that will certainly influenced by colonialism and imperialism and tragedy. So something to think about. I have this picture on top where this is one of the Saqqara mummies that was found in Egypt, and it was a massive, there's a lot of fanfare about this. There's a wonderful documentary on Netflix about the Saqqara excavations. It's a all Egypt specialist excavation. So repatriation is about returning of control, but sometimes repatriation, it's not so clear cut all the time. And I know a lot of Egyptian scholars here in this country that actually have more access to their heritage collections than they would in Egypt, because of politics and nationalism and hierarchy. Now, we're all pretty familiar with hierarchy, I'm sure, in how museums work and in different levels of staffing roles and things like that. So it's not any disrespect to Egypt and the amazing work that they're doing. I think it's wonderful, although I know this image did gain a lot of attention, because it wasn't done in a clean space, it wasn't done in a lab. There's lots of people not wearing masks or gloves. I know a lot of my conservator friends were feeling a little bit hot about this, but at the same time, this is one of those issues that we face a lot in working with human remains, which is, local specialists, local academics, local museum people, and what it is that they want to do with their ancestral heritage. So it's important to think about that as well. How do we work with human remains ethically? So some of the biggest questions that I look at and that I face and that I talk to the students about and talk to my colleagues about are these, and that's, what about descendant communities that are living now? What is it that they would like from collections that we manage? Is it limiting to archaeology to completely exclude these osteobiographies in our research? Some people want all human remains to be repatriated or buried. That can be problematic because we lose a lot of information about the past, because osteobiographies are so rich, but also, not everybody, reburial is not for everyone. And in fact, for some cultures, to be placing your ancestral remains in the cold, dark, damp earth was actually seen as was terrible. And again, a lot of indigenous communities were forced into reburial because of colonial politics and colonial power. So it's something to just think about, again, if you're working with collections that are non-British. And is there a difference between whole bodies and body parts when it comes to ethics and research? And I'm writing about this right now, especially in relation to cremations, because we are seeing a complete difference in how these collections are treated, both as far as museum display, but also in the collections themselves. People often look at cremation as, oh, it's just a bunch of bits of bone, but actually cremations are really rich information sources. And so we're writing up some standards for how to treat cremations right now. So be on the lookout for that if you do, because Britain, we have loads of cremations across the country, and a lot of collections that I talk to have only cremations in their store, and they don't know how to sort of look after them or wonder if there's anything they need to worry about. And sometimes now cremated bone has oftentimes, because of the high temperatures, has had the collagen, melted out. You just have the mineral, but sometimes if there's a little bit left, depending on the level of heat, you can then have some organic compounds there, and you need to watch out for mold and fluctuating humidity in those respects too, although it's very uncommon with cremations because the whole point is you're burning out the organic material. A big one that I see a lot on social media, that I'm talking to a lot about with various folks is it ethical to display human remains to the public? This is a highly debated issue now. I mean, I think more so in the last 10 years than I've ever seen. And I think, again, it goes back into sort of the public perception, the popularity, but then also the ethics and how troubling that can be for some visitors to stumble upon an exhibition where there's dead people. It's very different than, say, certain types of objects sometimes. And do the dead have rights? And this is a question that lawyers across the world right now, particularly in Australia, are actually negotiating with. And that will be interesting to see how that unfolds and how that can actually play into how we house collections of human remains. I just want to make a quick comment on terminology, how terminology matters, and depending on your audience. And so I'm very cautious about what kind of terms I use. Some people think this is overkill, and that's fine, especially those, because you have your scientific language and you want to stay fairly neutral. You have a responsibility to the collections and to the public. And so you do want to try and have less bias if you can about how you personally feel about dead. But terms like specimen, sample, object, things, material, those actually can be really offensive to many descendant communities. And I think we need to be mindful of that as well. I often will say human remains or ancestral remains. It again depends on kind of after having maybe some discussion with a group, what's their sense of it. Specimen, is very common in anatomical museums. You've got a hand in a jar and a wet specimen, right? And that's the only time I really use that term. And I appreciate that that's a very long-standing tradition in anatomical collections, of course. Sample we often use because someone's taking a sample from the bones, and then sample, but I often still say the human remains or the human remains samples. So even the term mummies is having a little bit of a restructure. So I'm not going to tell anyone how they should be speaking, but I do think you should be open to the kind of terminology that you're using, again, depending on your source communities, your stakeholders, and your public. So there's lots of really wonderful protocol guidelines for working with human remains over here in the UK and looking at Europe, and these are just some of my favorites. You may not need to really refer to the United Nations declarations on Indigenous peoples, but I often do, again, because I have collections from an international scope. I'm sure, obviously, we have the Human and Tissue Authority here in the UK, and that is the most critical because we have to be a licensed establishment, whether you're displaying human remains or having human remains for outreach or research. Human remains that are under 100 years old versus human remains that are over 100 years old, that's a very critical difference in what you can do with them or how you can display them. And so most collections from India and China are actually under 100 years old because they were scientific collections from, the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. So it is something to be thinking about. And I'm happy to answer questions or help you figure these things out. I really am. That's not just lip service. I think it's my ethical responsibility as a primarily human remains curator to do so. And it's also really fun getting to meet people, even though the circumstances can often be quite perhaps sad for some, or, we need to be mindful again about the dead and who we're looking after in this case. So these are just some of the main codes of ethics that I use broadly. What they don't do necessarily, though, is they do provide an ethical architecture, right? But the structure and how we fill that is less published on, which is usually the practicalities of what it means to be a steward for the dead, for ancestral remains, and how to have meaningful, productive dialogue when there might be communities who are feeling distrust and anger. Oops, sorry. Excuse me. So it's just something to think about. And then remains that the protocols that I use the most, though, which are very specific to human remains, are here. Although there are more, these are just some of the highlights, particularly here in Britain. I have this Society for Museum Archaeology fact sheet actually printed and on the wall in one of my collection spaces, one of the collection spaces, excuse me. And so if I've left anyone out, I'm sorry, but these are some of the main sources of how to box, how to sort of store human remains, what kind of boxes you need, what kind of tissue you need, how to make mounts regarding the dead human remains in the British Museum. That has a great article on building mounts and things for mummified remains, which I'm doing at the very, well, I did earlier today. So these are just some of the more critical documents that I use that have the more practical advice in them. And then if you're keen to know how osteologists or osteoarchaeologists actually analyze bone, you've got 2 free documents here that we use as standards for analyzing skeletal remains, so you can make yourself familiar with what it is that we do when we excavate bodies, all the different terms, the scientific language, making sure that you have sort of a consistency in your own catalog. And then Science and the Dead, which is going to be re-released this year, I believe. It's updated. This has got everything you need for understanding destructive sampling. What does ancient DNA do? How do you do it? What is stable isotope analysis? How big of a sample should I be giving that researcher? You know, these are all the questions that they try to document, and I've been a reviewer for this document. So it's really fantastic, and I make sure all the students working through here have access to that. And again, it's free from APABE and English Heritage, which is so cool. So very much about best practice, standard terminology, and what archaeologists coming into your collections might have done or be expecting you to ask them questions about, and vice versa. So I think these are really useful. And I know this is a lot of text, and I've only just put it on here like that because it's exactly what says in the guidance for the care of human remains in museums. So there's no misinterpretation of or my interpretation coming through. This is Article 2.5 from this Deaccessioning document, and you don't have to read it now, or you can, but this is just to show exactly what it is that we have as a national guideline. And something that isn't mentioned in this, though, again, is cremated remains. And there's a lot of looking at cremated remains now in light of repatriation, movements towards community involvement. Again, this is if you're dealing with folks that are not from Britain, but that are maybe from India, North America, Africa. If you have these collections in your collection, even the soil in the base of a box of a cremation should be kept, and that's all part of the repatriation process. So again, it's not necessarily published, which it will be once my colleagues and I finish the article, but it's really to fill in some gaps, especially with cremated remains, again, because there is a very clear difference in how these remains are treated from, say, whole bodies or skulls. And same with other body parts, oh, that's just a hand in a box. But actually, it's still human remains, and we need to be thinking about that and how we approach that, and have a consistency and a standard for everyone that we look after in our collection. And disposal of human remains is being talked about more. In fact, and I'm not going to name and shame, but there was a museum in Sweden that destroyed over 111 human remains that many of us in the same profession, protested, and we wanted to say, wait, maybe we can figure out descendant communities for these remains, but for various reasons, and unfortunately, I know, again, space and money are part of that, but a whole cohort of people were lost, and it does make us have to really think about how we dispose human remains, because technically you can't own human remains legally, but you can in some ways have sort of ownership if remains have been turned into something else, if there's been skill applied, and it's all very complex in the legal world. And I'm happy again to answer questions on that, because I have a role that I will talk about now, which is in the sale of human remains. And I'm currently I'm a trustee on the board. I'm the museum representative for the Biological Association, or the British Association of Biological Anthropology and Osteoarchaeology, which is called BABIO. So I run this sort of task force on analyzing the sale of human remains, and it's increasing significantly because of social media. And so I do think about disposal and how museums and institutions are doing that. And we're tracking to see if these remains show up online, and they are. And that's what's really starting to worry us. So we're seeing, and I do apologize if anyone's uncomfortable looking at these remains, but I do have to show you these to get my point across. So our subgroup in BABIO is really about educating the public about the objectification and commodification of the dead. And we want people to understand sort of the legal, the ethical, and the social ramifications, because a lot of the remains that are being sold again are Indigenous bodies that were part of under a colonial regime, but lots of British archaeology. So we're actually seeing an increase in sort of smaller, maybe archaeology societies that could be linked to museums, but they're going under, unfortunately. And then these lots are showing up on these auction houses, for example, like this one to be late medieval from an archaeological dig in County Durham. How are these remains making their way into the market? And this is something that we really need to watch, because we're also seeing an increase in destruction of cemeteries, grave sites, charnel houses. So we're actually seeing theft. And it's not just here in Britain, it's actually all over the world. And now the law is starting to get stronger as far as penalty. Fines are getting higher, because we're starting to see this increase in this trade. And a lot of it is coming from medical museums and potentially small sort of, private collectors as well, shifting things around. But it's worrying, and it's part of the disposal process, which, let's be honest, I mean, human remains don't often make it into a disposal process, because we understand the sensitive nature of them. But the market is becoming significant. And in fact, even a TV channel here in Britain did a whole documentary on how to get rich, and it was about selling human remains, and it was really difficult to watch. And it's really unfair, but it is technically legal to sell human remains in the UK. And so we're fighting an uphill battle, but what we're trying to get the public to understand is the ramifications of that. And so part of my role at BABIO is to produce a list. We've got a list of institutions that will house these collections in perpetuity, and to use them for educational purposes. And so I think that's something that we're negotiating. I'm not, again, naming and shaming anyone. I mean, lots of people like to own collections that are on the more morbidly curious side, and I totally understand that, being an old goth, but it's something that I have to think about, and it's something that we're seeing an increase of when it comes to disposal. And finally, like I said, so in 2022, I'm co-editing a manuscript on museums, heritage, and death that will have some articles and things in it about collections and sort of historically how we manage these collections, and how we look at death in museum spaces, because it's really important, because most museums, any museums, death is actually omnipresent, because you have grave goods in your collections, all these beautiful objects coming from these graves and these burials. You've got paintings of, death and the maiden in your Renaissance gallery. So death is really prominent, and it's actually a place where, for some, it's the first time they're actually facing their mortality. physically by looking at a body on display. And I think it's critical that we keep these conversations going about that and how we want to negotiate death in our collections, and what's going to be for our own well-being as well, for those of us that have to work with the dead, because nobody should have to necessarily face their mortality at work every day. Maybe if you're a mortician, but if you get into that field, you're expecting that, but maybe not if you're a collections assistant coming in and trying your first museum job, and then suddenly there you are faced with 10 skulls. So we need to be thinking about those issues as well. And so please reach out to me if you want any more information, if there's anything I can do to help you. I've also put the Babio sale of human remains subgroup. Like I said, we're just tracking at the moment where the sales are going and who is doing the selling. And there is an anonymous link on there if you want to report something. We're not able to, we're not going out and protesting this, but we are just kind of trying to figure out what our involvement could be on that, and how disposal of particularly medical institutions, is affecting the trade. I really appreciate you listening to me, and I'm happy to answer any of your questions at the panel. So have a really great day. Thank you.